Donald Trump's chances at winning the White House have surged to a new high of 74%. In fact, he can win upwards of 370 electoral votes. In this video, we're going to take a look at the 2024 electoral map based on the current polling averages in every single state. We're going to begin with the West Coast, 3 states that are generally among the most liberal in the country, but that may not be the case this time around. Washington isn't even going to be a solid blue state. In fact, Joe Biden leads by less than 10% on average in a state that he carried by over double that margin 4 years ago, 19.2% down to just 9 in 4 years. Washington is going to be a likely Democratic state. Down in Oregon, things are ever so slightly better for the incumbent president. He leads by just over 12 percentage points, so Oregon is technically going to be a solid blue state, but this really isn't where the president wants to be. He led by a larger margin 4 years ago, and not to mention in California, Joe Biden's margin has gone down by nearly 10 points. The Golden State voted for the now president by 29 points in 2020. Today, Joe Biden leads by just 21% in the state. In fact, a poll from February shows Trump within 20 points of Biden in a state as liberal as California. I mean, even this 10-point shift is significant because that translates to millions of votes in a state as large as California. Republicans are definitely making inroads here, but they do still have quite a long ways to go in terms of actually making California red once again. Next up, we have 2 of the most important states in the country, Nevada and Arizona. Not that much in electoral votes, but these states are going to signal important shifts. If Joe Biden doesn't win either of these states, it is very unlikely that he is going to get to 270 electoral votes. These are 2 states that Biden carried in the last election. Nevada by 2.4%. Arizona, Biden flipped, won it by 0.3%, becoming the first Democrat to win it since 1996. Today, however, in both of these states, Donald Trump is leading by likely margins. In the silver state of Nevada, the former president is ahead by 5.2%, and he has seen a post-debate surge in the state. According to the polling average on June 27th, which is when that first presidential debate aired, Donald Trump was ahead by 2.8%. Today, he leads by 5.2. Trump has actually been ahead throughout nearly the entirety of the election cycle, which was not the case back in 2020, and is in a very strong position to flip Nevada and become the first Republican to win the state since 2004. So Nevada is going to be in the likely Republican column, while in Arizona, we see a pretty similar story. Trump plus 5.4%. Once again, throughout the entirety of the past year, Donald Trump has been ahead. His lead has basically stayed around the same since the debate, but it's already been pretty healthy. There's no doubt that Trump is going to flip back Arizona and end the Democrats' very short streak of victories in the state. Before we continue, only 10% of you guys are actually subscribed, so please take the time to subscribe right now for more content like this leading up to the election in November, and follow me on Twitter for daily election updates, link in the description below. We're not going to fill in many of the solid red states in the middle of the country. They're simply not going to be competitive, and we've seen polling from them before that showed Trump leading by solid margins. So Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, North and South Dakota, all of Nebraska with the exception of the 2nd District. That 2nd District right now is lean Republican, as well as Kansas and Oklahoma. All of these states are going to be solid red. Now moving on to Colorado and New Mexico, 2 states that Joe Biden won pretty handily last time around. Colorado by a 14-point margin, New Mexico by 11, both within that double-digit range. But today, Joe Biden leads by just 6.5% in Colorado, and I can guarantee you these polls are showing a better story for Biden than reality does, because if you look at what's happened over the last few months, Biden's approval has fallen pretty significantly to an all-time low. And Joe Biden leading by 6 points in January, he's probably leading by less than 5 points now, just as a result of Trump's upward shift basically since the beginning of this year. But according to the data that we do have, which is still pretty outdated, Joe Biden is on track to winning Colorado by just under 7 points. Down in New Mexico, this is the only state with a Hispanic majority, and as that bloc of voters continues to move away from Biden and the Democrats, Republicans have a chance at putting New Mexico in play, and this is actually one of the states that Donald Trump is heavily targeting this time around, even though he really didn't come too close last time around. But current polling shows Biden ahead by just 7 points. These 3 prior polls were conducted back in 2022 and 2023. So there's definitely evidence that New Mexico is going to be much more competitive than it was last time around. But for right now, it is still going to be likely blue. Texas, on the other hand, is going to be likely Republican. Donald Trump leads by 9 points in the polling average. He is at 50%. Republicans have been doing okay over the last decade in the Lone Star State. They're still winning it every time, but the margins haven't been as solid as they were under Mitt Romney, for example. But Donald Trump did win Texas by 9 points in 2016, and that's probably the margin we're going to see this time around in 2024, an uptick from his 5-point victory in 2020. So Texas is going to easily be in the likely Republican state. I mean, there were talks in 2020 about how Biden could actually win Texas, how Democrats should target the state. I mean, that idea is just totally out of the door this time around. There's no chance Biden's really going to try in Texas because he really has no chance at winning the state, considering how much less popular he is. Now, moving on to Alaska and Hawaii. In Alaska, we have Donald Trump leading by 12%, according to the only poll, while in Hawaii, Joe Biden is on track to winning it by a solid margin. It's probably going to be significantly less than his 29-point margin as a result of his poor handling of the Maui fires, but Hawaii is simply too solid blue of a state to really change, at least at this point in time. We're now going to shift our attention up to the Midwest, which is going to be the most electorally consequential region in the entire country. It's going to be a state in this region that gets either candidate over that 270 electoral vote threshold. Traditionally, the focus has always been on Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, but this time around, we could also see a lot of money and effort going into winning Minnesota as the state becomes increasingly in play for Donald Trump. Joe Biden won the state of Minnesota by 7 points in 2020, but 4 years prior, Hillary Clinton showed that Democrats could be vulnerable here, winning it by just less than 2 points. Minnesota today, though, Biden leads by 3%, and the most recent Emerson College poll actually shows a tie between the two candidates. So really, Minnesota is not a state where Democrats are doing well at all, especially considering the fact that this state has the longest unbroken Democratic voting streak. It has not voted Republican since 1972. But this time around in 2024, Donald Trump could be the first Republican to win the state in over half a century. Right now, though, Minnesota is still going to fall into the Democratic column as a lean state. Down in Iowa, 6 electoral votes. Donald Trump will win by 11.5% according to the polling average, just under that 12-point threshold. Is a state that Trump has done very well in the last 2 elections. 2016, he flipped the state, winning it by 9 points. 2020, the margin was 8.2. I mean, just go back to 2012. This was a Democratic state that went for Obama by nearly 6 points. Today, that's basically unfathomable. Democrats have no chance at winning any major statewide elections in Iowa anytime soon. So Iowa is going to fall into the likely Republican category, just barely missing out on being solid. Wisconsin, though, is going to be quite a bit more competitive. 10 electoral votes. It's essentially a must-win state for Joe Biden. He actually won the state by a smaller margin in 2020 than Trump did in 2016. And so if there's any of the blue wall states, Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania, that Biden loses first, it is probably going to be Wisconsin, at least based on historical trends. And today, Donald Trump leads by 2.2% in the state. We saw that on the night of the debate, the polling average had both candidates in a dead heat, But today, Trump's numbers have gone up. He now leads by over 2 points. Wisconsin is probably going to flip in favor of the former president, especially considering the fact that 4 years ago at this point in time, Joe Biden was actually leading by 6.5% in the polling average. The polling really overestimated Biden's support here last time around, and this time, Wisconsin is going to be lean Republican. Down in Illinois, 19 electoral votes. This is usually a safe blue state, but looking at the latest polling for 2024, Joe Biden leads by less than 12 points on average, around a 10 to 11 point margin. So the state of Illinois is going to be likely Democratic, while Indiana, of course, is going to be solid red, even without Mike Pence as Trump's running mate. In Michigan, 15 electoral votes. The Wolverine state is going to be critical for Joe Biden. This is actually a state that if Biden doesn't win, he essentially has no chance at winning the White House a second time. Donald Trump leads by 0.6% in the polling average. And if you look at the trends over the last few months, things have actually gotten better for Biden here. Trump led by 5 points earlier this year. The margin has been cut down to less than 1 point, but it's still concerning considering the fact that just like in Wisconsin, Biden was leading by a pretty big 7.5% margin in July of 2020. So he really does have a lot of catch-up to do if he wants to win Michigan and in turn have a shot at winning the presidential election. But for right now, Michigan is going to be tilt Republican. Ohio, though, it votes pretty similarly to Iowa now. We've seen Trump flip the state in 2016 and then hold it by nearly the same margin in 2020. We're probably going to see an increase in the margin for Trump in Ohio, just like we are in Iowa. The polling average right now in the Buckeye State shows Trump up by 10.7%. That's not enough to make it solid, but it is going to very reliably be a likely Republican state, voting in favor of Donald Trump. And to finish off the Midwest, we're going to take a look at the Keystone State of Pennsylvania. 19 electoral votes. This is Joe Biden's birth state, and it is the biggest prize in the Midwest. Donald Trump leads by 5.3% in the polling average here. It is a pretty big margin. Compared again to 2020, Joe Biden led by 6.5% on July 11th, 2020, and Trump's margin, just like in Wisconsin, has surged since the presidential debate. The debate was on the 27th. Trump led by 2.8% then. Now he's ahead by 5.3%, and his margin today is the largest it has ever been. Pennsylvania was actually pretty competitive throughout most of this year, but that is no longer the case. The Keystone State is on track to being a likely Republican state, just as red as states like Arizona, Ohio, and even Texas. Moving up into the Northeast, we have a region where Democrats should honestly not have any trouble winning basically every state. The only one that you could argue could even be remotely close was New Hampshire, but this time around that simply is no longer the case. I'm going to fill in the more solid liberal states first. So we have the District of Columbia, Maryland, Biden's home state of Delaware, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, and the 1st District of Maine, but we do have 4 remaining states left to cover that are going to be a lot more competitive than they were 4 years ago. We're going to begin with New York, a state that Joe Biden won by 23% in 2020. Today, Biden leads by 7.5%, less than 1/3 of his margin in the last election. And this is not just according to the 2 most recent polls. Just look at all the polling going all the way back to October of last year. Joe Biden has not been able to break a 12-point margin more than once. And this really is concerning the fact that New York is supposed to be a Democratic stronghold, but that is clearly no longer the case. Donald Trump is actually competitive in New York, and that is just a good way to sum up the election right now. Things simply are not going Biden's way. Down in New Jersey, we see a pretty similar margin. Joe Biden leads by 7 points according to the only poll that we have conducted by Emerson College. So the state is going to be likely blue as well. While up in New Hampshire, Donald Trump is behind by 3 points against Biden, but he actually leads in the most recent poll. This is a poll conducted after the first presidential debate. And if you look at the other polls, one of them is from all the way back in January, and the other one is, of course, conducted a month before the debate. So we really haven't seen the effects of that. But New Hampshire is a winnable state for Trump. He came within 0.5% of winning the Granite State in 2016, and in 2024, Biden definitely is in trouble here. New Hampshire is going to only be lean Democratic, while up in Maine, the 2nd district typically is not solid red, but according to what we're seeing in the polling from the region this time around, it is going to be a solid red district. While the state as a whole, things are going to get pretty competitive. Trump actually leads by 6% in the most recent poll, and considering the fact that all of the other polls are from last year, nearly a year ago, I'm going to place Maine into the lean Republican category by weighing that newest poll a little bit more. I mean, just consider the fact that Maine voted for Biden by 9 points, and you'll see just how dramatic of a shift this really is. And to finish off the map, we only have states in the Deep South. A lot of them, though, are going to be reliably Republican, so we're just going to fill in those states first, putting Trump up at 253 electoral votes. Only Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida are going to be even remotely competitive. So starting off with Virginia, a state that Biden carried by double digits last time around, today Biden leads by just 2 points in the polling average, and according to the only polls we've had conducted this year, Joe Biden and Donald Trump are in a dead heat, a tie according to the 2 latest polls from the Commonwealth of Virginia. Just 1 year after Biden was elected, Virginia actually chose a Republican, Glenn Youngkin, to be its governor. Virginia is a winnable state for Republicans. Youngkin showed that 3 years ago, and Donald Trump can definitely put the state in play, but for right now, Virginia is still going to be lean Democratic. Down in the Tar Heel state of North Carolina, this state was pretty competitive last time around. Biden came within 1.5 points of actually winning it. Trump won North Carolina by nearly 4 points in the election prior. We're probably going to see a return to a margin more like what we saw in 2016, as Donald Trump does lead in North Carolina by nearly 6 points. Out of all the competitive states, Trump is performing the best in North Carolina, a state he did win in the last election. I mean, just look at this margin. There really hasn't been any point where Biden's even come close. And if you look at where we were 4 years ago, Joe Biden was actually leading throughout most of the election cycle in the Tar Heel state, but of course, even in the end, he wasn't able to pull off a victory. And so North Carolina is going to be likely for Donald Trump. While down in Georgia, the former president's performing pretty well as well. Trump leads by 4%. Again, it really hasn't gotten very competitive at any point throughout the entirety of this cycle. Now, the Peach State is actually a state that Biden won in the last election. He flipped it, becoming the first Democrat to win Georgia since 1992. It was the most competitive state in the entire country, but this time around, that clearly is not going to be the case. Georgia will fall into the lean Republican column. And finally, in Florida, 30 electoral votes. The state has taken a sharp rightward turn over the last few years. And if you look at the polling average, Trump leads by 7.6%. It's probably not going to be solid red, but Biden doesn't really have a chance here. And so with all the states filled in, Donald Trump is on track to winning 315 electoral votes to Joe Biden's 223. I mean, just look at the margins in these supposedly competitive states. Trump is blowing Biden out of the water. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you like this video down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below who you think will win the election. And make sure you take the time to subscribe right now for more content like this leading up to the election in November.